Ready for a deep dive? We're tackling a topic that's got more layers than, well, you'll see, alcohol in the Muslim world. But forget any simplistic prohibition narrative you might be expecting.
Yeah, the idea of this total ban on alcohol throughout Islamic history, it's just not accurate.
That's what I thought when I saw this article, Alcohol in the Muslim World. It's like, we picture this long history of strict no alcohol. But it sounds like a much more recent thing, huh?
Exactly. Historically, it was more about managing alcohol. Like, think about taxes, controlling where it could be sold, who could even make it. Those are the go-to
So
methods.
less about Islam having one stance on alcohol and more about how different societies at different points in time chose to approach it.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting, right? We see social customs, political pressures, religious interpretations all kind of intertwine. And our article really breaks it down well into three distinct eras. We start, of course, with the Age of Empires. Just picture like the marketplaces of Damascus or a fancy banquet in Cordoba.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. But was alcohol like a regular part of life, even in these big Islamic empires?
Oh, yeah, it seems so. We're not talking about something hidden or shameful. There are manuscripts from that time with like super detailed instructions on how to ferment different drinks. It was part of fine dining, hospitality. Some wines, for example, were prized for their quality. Definitely a mark of prestige at those banquets you mentioned.
So not just religious law, but social customs, even class, all playing a part. Were there differences in how various social classes consumed alcohol?
Absolutely, you're spot on. Think about how alcohol taxation worked. The Ottomans, for instance, used taxes not just to discourage excessive drinking, especially among Muslims, but also as a source of revenue, often levied on non-Muslim communities. They were often the ones permitted to produce and consume alcohol, you see, under the millet system.
And just for those who might not know, the millet system basically gave religious minorities within the Ottoman Empire some autonomy in handling their own affairs, including certain religious laws.
Exactly. And this system, it had a big impact on how alcohol production and consumption played out. Different communities, their own customs, their own rules surrounding alcohol. So you had this fascinating mix of practices within the empire.
Okay, so we've got social customs, class, economics, religious laws, all woven together. Not a simple story at all. But empires change, right? So how did this shift from these huge empires to more modern, centralized states impact how people thought about alcohol?
Well, that's where our story takes a really fascinating turn, because as we move into this era of the modern state, leaders had new challenges, right? They had to consolidate their authority, figure out how to deal with various religious groups within their newly formed states, and of course, make sure things were economically stable. And you know what became a surprisingly important tool in all of this?
I'm on the edge of my seat. Don't tell me it was alcohol policies.
You got it. Alcohol policies. They became a point of leverage for these new states.
So it wasn't just can we drink, but a whole web of power, religious anxieties, and economic realities.
Precisely. And some historical anecdotes really show this. Like, there's this case from the Ottoman Empire where some officials got in trouble, not just for drinking, but for being drunk on the job.
Yeah, showing up to a meeting tipsy. Probably not a good look back then either.
Exactly. It really shows how alcohol became this point where religious ideals met the practical side of governing.
This is so much more than a boring history lesson. It's like we're seeing the inner workings of these societies, how their views on a simple drink were shaped by all these different social and political forces. But I have a feeling it's about to get even more complicated, right? Okay, so we've traveled through ancient empires, sipped wine at fancy banquets, even crashed a few Ottoman meetings where maybe someone had a little too much to drink.
I don't think we were crashing those meetings.
Right, observing from a respectful distance. But empires change, and as we move into the 20th century, things get really interesting. Globalization, colonialism, mass media, it's a whole new world. How did all that impact how Muslim societies viewed alcohol?
Yeah, you could say it added a whole other layer of complexity. I mean, it's tempting to think, oh, colonialism, Western powers forcing alcohol on everyone, but it's not that straightforward.
Okay, so what's the nuance here? What's an example of how colonialism actually played out?
Well, the article talks about wine production in North Africa. Under French rule, vineyards in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, they were booming. But it wasn't just a case of the French coming in saying, everyone drink wine.
There's always more to it. What was happening behind the scenes?
Think about it. The French used wine production strategically. It was about controlling the economy, making money. They pushed, sometimes even forced, local farmers to focus on grapes over their traditional crops. This created dependencies.
So alcohol wasn't just a drink, it was a tool to control things, to exert power.
Exactly. And those colonial legacies, they stick around. Even after independence, a lot of North African countries were still big wine producers, exporting mostly to Europe. Create this internal conflict. Is this part of our heritage, or is it a reminder of colonial times?
The past has a way of sticking with us. But we've got colonial influence, and then there's mass media, globalization. How did those factors play into all of this?
This is where it gets really interesting. See, in the late 20th century, you have all this Western culture coming in, music, movies, advertising, and a lot of it just showed drinking as normal, even cool.
Yeah, a catchy jingle, a cool ad campaign, that stuff works. Did it have a noticeable effect?
Oh, absolutely. It's like this cultural tug of war started between tradition and modernity. The article mentions culture wars around drinking in Turkey.
Culture wars. That sounds intense. What does that even mean in this context?
Basically, you had parts of society becoming more secular, adopting some Western drinking habits, right?
Mm.
And then you had this resurgence of more conservative Islamic values that saw alcohol as this threat.
So alcohol became a symbol, a battleground for this bigger cultural debate.
Exactly. And this tension led to huge arguments, policy changes. But the impact of globalization, it wasn't just these big cultural clashes. Think about migration, people moving around. That changes things on a more personal level, too.
Right, because you take your own relationship with alcohol, your own customs with you.
Exactly. Like the article mentions Algerian cafes in France. Some cafe owners, even though they were Algerian from more conservative backgrounds, they served alcohol. Caused real tension. How much of your old traditions do you keep when you're in a new place?
It makes you think, was it about fitting in to survive or a conscious choice to break from tradition, or most likely something in between?
And that's what's so fascinating about this topic, right? These aren't just big historical trends. They're real lives, real dilemmas playing out in homes, in cafes, all over.
It's amazing to think that to truly understand alcohol in the Muslim world, you have to engage with centuries of history, so many layers. But it's not just history, is it? It's something that still resonates today. Wow, from those ancient empires to colonial times, and then this whole wave of globalization, we've been through a lot. It's amazing how those historical events, they're still shaping things today.
It just goes to show history, it's not just dates in a book, it's alive. It affects how we deal with complicated issues even now. And when it comes to alcohol in the Muslim world, those echoes of the past, they're still there.
So what kind of echoes are we talking about in the 21st century? What's happening with alcohol in these societies now?
Well, one big trend is how modern states, even the ones that don't totally ban alcohol, they're using public health to justify stricter rules.
Interesting. So it's not just about religion dictating policy anymore.
Oh, religion's still a big factor in many places, but there's this added focus on things like, less drunk driving, less public intoxication, preventing liver disease. Those are concerns that resonate even with folks who aren't super religious.
Totally. It's a way to talk about controlling alcohol that's like more universal, less focused on religion.
Exactly. And it often lines up with what global health organizations are saying. The article mentioned the World Health Organization, the WHO. They've been pretty vocal about the downsides of drinking.
Makes sense. But is it cynical to wonder if maybe some of these modern states are just using public health as a reason, a cover, to crack down on something they see as morally wrong?
It's a valid question, definitely. We have to remember these public health campaigns, they don't exist in a bubble. They're tied up with old anxieties, cultural biases, and yeah, even political agendas. But, we shouldn't dismiss the genuine worry about the harm alcohol can cause. A lot of these policies, they come from a good place.
It seems like anytime you really dig into history, it's never simple, is it? There are always layers.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what makes a topic like this so important to think about, to be critical about, because when we look at these debates about alcohol, we're really wrestling with huge questions: individual freedom, government power, how cultures change, and how the past still affects us.
I know I've had to challenge some of my own assumptions. It's easy to think of this as black and white, like it's either forbidden or it's not when it comes to alcohol in the Muslim world. But we've seen it's so much more complex than that.
Absolutely. That's a big takeaway. We have to approach this topic and so many others with an understanding of history, with cultural sensitivity, and with a willingness to really engage with all the complexities of our world.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one question you think our listeners should keep in mind? Something to think about even after the episode is over.
Here's a thought. Are these top-down prohibitions, even if they're about public health, are they always the best way to handle problems with alcohol? Or do they maybe cause more problems, like driving drinking underground, creating resentment, preventing real conversations?
Those are great questions. It makes you think maybe other approaches like education, harm reduction, or dealing with the reasons why people abuse alcohol in the first place. Maybe those would work better in the long run.
Exactly. There's no magic solution that fits everywhere. Every place has its own unique situation. But when we engage with this historical perspective, we can ask better questions, and that leads to a much deeper understanding.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. I'm ready for a nice, refreshing glass of water, I think.
Water for me too, maybe with a little historical awareness and a splash of critical thinking.
To that, I say cheers.